Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail part 25. What we were seeing, although we didn't realize it at the time, was our first case of Kanalkrankheit, the so-called channel sickness. A combination of chronic stress and acute fatigue. At first, there were isolated cases, but as the battle dragged on, there were to be more and more cases of the evil disease. The symptoms were many and various, but usually surfaced as stomach cramps and vomiting, loss of appetite and consequently weight, and acute irritability. Typically, the patient's consumption of alcohol and cigarettes would increase, and he would show more and more signs of exhaustion. There was little leave, and unlike the RAF pilots, we were not to be circulated to quiet zones for short periods of rest and refitting. There was nothing our doctors could do either. The principle of battle fatigue had not yet been established, and it was felt that as soon as anyone was taken out of the line because he was showing signs of stress, there would be a flood. So the doctors resorted to diagnosing appendicitis. This minor operation ensured that at least the pilot would not be flying for about 2 or 3 weeks. Part and parcel of Kanalkrankheit were the symptoms which affected the aircraft. Instruments would fail, motors would run hot or lose oil pressure just to be remedied by returning to base. Ground crews would spend time chasing a fall through a machine only to find nothing amiss. Following a Werkstattflug, the aircraft would be pronounced fully mechanically fit for service. A few hours later, it would be back with guns that would not fire in the air, but which let loose a hail of bullets on the ground. The ground crews were faithful to their pilots and, to their credit, tried to cover for them, but when there was no chance of finding a fault, the former had to speak up. We all felt the strain, but when in the middle of August the command reshuffle took place, there was damn near a mutiny in our Gruppe. Our commander, Hauptmann von Eschwege, was called up to Luftflotte 2 headquarters and returned with the Iron Cross First Class. It was arranged for the pilots of the 3 squadrons to be paraded at their separate dispersals, while von Eschwege made a short speech in which he explained that it was with great regret on his part that he'd been relieved of command of First Group of Fighter Squadron 52 because of a grumbling appendix. He wished us all good hunting and many victories and left for his appendix operation and thereafter on to a relatively safe seat at the fighter training center at Merseburg. There was almost uproar amongst the pilots, not only because of his Iron Cross, but also because he was effectively being rested whilst we were still having to remain at the sharp end of things. This wasn't the last time that the strings would be pulled for some of the more senior officers, and it is significant, I think, that during the Battle of Britain our Gruppe never lost any personnel of the rank of squadron leader or higher. Hauptmann Wolfgang Ewald replaced von Eschwege as group commander and inherited quite a disconsolate brood of fighter pilots. Outside the realities of the air war, we lived quite well. Our tent city was home now, and we all really enjoyed the outdoor life. We had one of the best cooks for our squadron, and he managed to produce attractive meals from the most basic military supplies, sometimes augmented by rabbits or a partridge if I chose to go hunting with Terry. Eggs were always plentiful because there was a standard allowance of eggs and chocolate for each pilot in accordance with the number of missions he flew. To supplement all of this, our supply truck was sent weekly to Reims, which had remained untouched during the advance to the coast. It had been declared an open city, that is, one which was an island within the occupied zone, still administered by the French but with free access by all, subject to the granting of permission by the Army of Occupation. The French franc had been devalued against the Reichsmark, and our money had greater purchasing power. Having very soon recovered from the shock of our invasion, the French merchants were keen to trade with us, and all supplies at Reims were plentiful. In Germany we had occasionally drunk our native Sekt, which is champagne, but it was expensive. Now we could indulge ourselves with the very best of the French wines, and in particular champagne. We would buy Pommery, Moët and Chandon, Veuve Clicquot, and the best of the red wines by the case. Although most of us were still not outwardly showing major signs of nerves, arguments were becoming more frequent, tempers frayed quicker, and the majority found a few glasses of good red wine before bed helped us sleep. The strain of unrelenting frontline flying was beginning to show. I wrote quite a few letters at the time, but I cannot find the one which refers to the loss of my very close friend Hinnerk Waller. Just before midday on September the 6th, we were intercepted by British fighters east of Tonbridge. I was close to Hinnerk when he was attacked, but I wasn't in a position to go to his aid. I watched helplessly as bullets ripped holes in the wings and the slipstream peeled the aluminum back like thin springs. Gradually, the aircraft rolled away and I saw the canopy come off. Almost shouting all my encouragement to him, I saw him drop from the stricken aircraft and fall away. Still at 9,000 meters, roughly 30,000 feet, I saw his parachute deploy and felt some relief, although he hung in the harness like a broken doll. At that altitude, he certainly would have blacked out almost immediately from oxygen starvation. I had only seconds to wish him well in my mind before I myself had to get out of there. We were actually back at Coquel debriefing before Hinnerk would have landed. Looking at our watches, we all agreed on a time and tried to make light of his loss by a brief celebration of his official coming down to earth about half an hour after he had bailed out. I was sure that he was okay, but we'd all miss our farmer's son. Another thing which makes me think that there are a few letters missing is that in none of the others do I mention that both I and Hinnerk had been promoted to Oberleutnant. There was only Kühle's scribbled remark on the envelope of my earlier letter. By mid-September of 1940, we were short of fully airworthy aircraft. We had plenty of pilots, but there was a dwell in the production and reconditioning of aircraft. This situation would soon be reversed as more aircraft arrived and we lost more pilots. However, for the time being, our squadron was flying at 1/3 of its strength. On September 8, 1940, I wrote another letter to my mom. It read as such. Dear Mother, many thanks for your and Father's letter. His letter impressed me. It shows the true soul of a soldier. It has just dawned upon me what he went through in the First World War, what it means to live for 4.5 years not knowing what will happen to one in the next few minutes. But all this thinking is really useless. We have to do our duty and say more than that is not worth thinking about. Hurrah! Just now there was a telephone call. Reichsmarschall Göring has announced that he gives the highest praise to Fighter Squadron 52 for yesterday's performance. Yesterday we worked our greatest magic so far over London. During half an hour, more than 500,000 kilograms of bombs were dropped on London. We were flying fighter escort and at the moment I am leading the squadron because the chief has a upset stomach. Right now we have only 4 aircraft which are fully airworthy, but that's fine. The losses from 4 bomber wings were only 4 aircraft, but with a further 25 fighters and destroyers, which are Me-110s, but for this the targets in London were erased. Hopefully the chief will soon be well again. After all, he has more experience. When rereading this last letter today, I can still clearly see the images of that day in my mind. It was an unbelievable sight. In the first wave in the late afternoon there were about 1,000 aircraft assembled in layers. They are stacked at about 600 meters intervals. We were flying high cover as we approached London, and there we could already see many oil tanks burning with huge clouds of smoke reaching high into the sky. The main targets were the docks, which were easy to find on the distinctive U-bend of the Thames. Once in a while we would snatch a glance down and see the flashes of bombs as they exploded and the shockwaves radiating out with the forces of the explosion. But from our altitude, some 10,000 meters, about 32,000 feet, these were just pinpricks of dirty light. More impressive was the oily smoke. There wasn't much time to take anything but the briefest observations. We were in the hottest of combat areas, and anyone who was distracted for too long was going to end his day there and then. Everywhere was danger, from the British fighters, from the heavy flak and from loose barrage balloons, one of which was floating around near our altitude and burning in a tumult of color and smoke. Now we really came up against the full force of the RAF. If the calculations of our high command had been correct, there should have been minimal fighter opposition to us now. But whilst we saw numerous head-on and flank attacks on the bombers below, we were often too busy with our own defense to intervene. There were constant dogfights with aircraft wheeling and diving, pursuing each other, sometimes with success, sometimes not. There were stark black lines diving down, showing the path of a stricken aircraft, and parachutes floating in the thin cold air. There was tragedy too, as I watched one parachute begin to burn, its helpless charge falling faster and faster. Hard to take too were the accidents of identification. I sat helpless with the hard lump of frustration boiling in my chest as I saw below me a 109 latch onto a tail of another of our fighters, and then to see them suddenly linked by 4 straight grey lines as the guns were fired. Quickly the yellow tail of the leading fighter ignited and it rolled out to dive towards the ground. In such tense and charged surroundings, such mistakes were inevitable. Sometimes I wish I had the skill of an artist so that I could have recorded these beautiful but awe-inspiring sights. The pure azure blue of the sky with the sun dimmed by the sinister smoke penetrating to extreme altitude, this interwoven and cross-hatched by the contrails of fighters locked in their life and death struggles. And amongst this, the burning balloons and the few parachutes in splendid and incongruous isolation. These images are clear and bright in my mind today, and it is to my regret that such fantastic scenes will only live as long as the few of us who saw them and survived. After returning to base, we were amused to see Hauptmann Förster's intercepts of the British radio. He was still monitoring the frequencies and had picked up many references to an elite yellow-nosed wing which seemed to be everywhere at once, very bold in its attacks and very numerous. We had now got what we youngsters had been waiting for, almost continuous combat sorties. But fairly quickly we began to feel the fatigue and the tiredness that comes with living under constant threat. Time after time the adrenaline would surge into our blood as we flew towards the combat zone. We would feel the relief of returning to base, but would then have to cope with the emotions of having lost friends and colleagues, knowing also that within minutes we would have to do it all over again. It seemed that every time my spirits were at a low ebb, something else would come along to plunge me deeper down. Soon after the loss of Hinnerk, for instance, I was just returning to base in our staff car when I saw a lone 109 make an approach and land. While still rolling, the engine stopped and the fighter came to a halt out on the field. I could see from the markings that it wasn't one of ours, and because all of our aircraft were down, I was able to drive out to it, arriving at the same time as some of our ground crew. They lifted the hood and inside was the lifeless body of an Oberleutnant. He must have died the moment he shut the engine down. Taking the body out, we laid it out on the ground and found that he had severe wounds to the abdomen. These had caused the young man to bleed to death. Indeed, his parachute pack was saturated in blood, which ran from it as we moved him. He had done a remarkable job in getting himself and his aircraft home, but it hadn't been quick enough to save his life. It was a shattering reminder of what waited for all of us every day we flew. It wasn't often that we actually saw our dead comrades. Initially, there was little aggressive action from the British once we were at base. It was rare for us to suffer an attack in the early days, but on one such occasion a light bomber crept in at night and let one bomb go which exploded close to the Werfzug, which is the repair shop tent. It only caused a small crater, but when the lists of equipment which had been lost in this explosion began to come through, it became more than remarkable how much material had apparently been stacked on the exact spot where the bomb had fallen. Indeed, it soon became clear that if it had all perished in the way claimed, the crater itself could not have contained this vast amount of missing equipment. For some time now, the quartermaster's bookkeepers had been waiting for such an event to write off everything which had been damaged or lost in our campaign so far. Certainly, the crew of the bomber never knew how successful they'd been. September 13th, 1940. I wrote another letter to my mother. It read as such. Dear Mother, many thanks for your congratulations on my promotion. It's really true, but still feels a bit strange. Many of the others have got their promotions as well. During the last few days we've had bad weather again. Meanwhile, we've installed a stove in our tent. However, with all the rain, it's not been too agreeable. At this time, I am planning to be disloyal. Yesterday, we received 2 aircraft which are fitted with the cannons in the wings. I'm taking one and the chief is taking the other. Therefore, it is with a broken heart that I am abandoning my 16. It's sad because it was the most loyal aircraft in the squadron, but cannons are cannons. Now another man will get 16, my new machine will be yellow too. I hope that it will be as good a comrade as 16 has been. Today the new plane is being serviced and tomorrow, on my birthday, I'll take it on a mission for the first time. Let's hope that the weather soon improves so that we can finalize things with the British. I find it curious that I'd become so attached to my aircraft. It was after all only a machine. But pilots are notoriously superstitious and I had done a lot in that aircraft. We'd had our problems, but we'd always got home, and I'd seen my first real combat in the 16. I had spent much time along with my ground crew tuning this aircraft to my personal taste, and with that, I suppose, I'd begin to imbue it with some of my personality. Certainly, I felt that she responded to the odd kind word or the promise of a rest and a full service. But I had to move on, and Yellow 2 was waiting. However, I do believe that after our last flight I said goodbye to 16 and gave her unyielding metal skin an affectionate final slap. Yellow 2 was a Bf-109E4, which meant that she'd been fitted with the new FF-type 20mm cannons in the wings. This gave her a formidable hitting power and, I hoped, a real edge when I needed it. Yellow 2 wasn't factory fresh, but had been used by another pilot and came with 3 stripes on the tail, which meant 3 confirmed victories. I was hopeful that this would be a good omen for me and that I'd soon be adding my own stripes as we began to gather our strength for what must surely be the death throes of the RAF over Britain. September 17th, 1940. Here's another letter. Dear Mother, now we've been celebrating my 22nd birthday for the last 2 days. Great days indeed. On my birthday I flew 2 missions, one in my old 16 and then one in my new 2. It is a much faster aircraft and I don't have to keep over-revving the engine to keep up with the Chief, as I did with 16. However, it is not yet as clean and orderly as my 16, but we'll change that in time. In the meantime, Mother, I can feel the anger slowly building inside me that I haven't had a victory yet. I'm about the only officer in the Gruppe who has not, to date, logged at least one victory. Bad Goebel has 3, Oberleutnant Lesmann now has 10, and the new Oberleutnant with the 2nd Squadron has 8. It's just that there seems to be no movement in our squadron. Altogether, we now have 55 confirmed victories for the Gruppe, but none for me. What a sorry state, but I can't help it. It's almost beginning to look like I'm not meant to succeed here, but I'll stick with it, during my duty. But enough of this. There are others who have no victories and have been shot down. At least, I'm in a better position than them. Out of those that are missing, we now know that 4 are prisoners, but we don't know about Waller and Christoph Geller yet. At least, I saw Hinnerk's parachute open. Yesterday, we had another large raid over London. Over there, we met amazingly strong fighter opposition. I believe that the British are concentrating everything they have left around the capital. It was a wild experience. A pity that the weather wasn't better. If it had been, we'd been in a better position to finish them off. Somehow, the army should get into action now. This morning we wanted to go to London again, but there was too much cloud and a high risk of icing, so no chance. Now we hope for good weather. About another 8 days would finish things. Let's hope for an improvement. September the 22nd, 1940. Dear Mother, during the last few days it was rather quiet here, but not quiet enough for us to have got away from base, because we are kept on constant readiness. The only thing I have to do at present is to go hunting, as a result of which several rabbits and partridges have enriched our diet. By the way, at last I have succeeded. 3 days ago I shot down a Spitfire in the area of Ashford. Let's hope that this is just the beginning. The British are slowly getting on our nerves at night. Because of their persistent activity, our AA guns are in virtually continuous use, and so we can hardly close our eyes. But there's nothing else we can do about that other than curse. If they'd come in daylight, there'd be a reckoning. I'm anxious to learn whether, after all we've done, invasion will really get started this year. I really don't remember much about this first successful action at all. Other incidents are crystal clear, but this first victory for me has been erased from my memory. Possibly, it was such an emotive experience that my mind had filtered it out. For whatever reason, I cannot remember any details at all. I think that, in view of my previous comments on personal victories and scores, it's worth examining my remarks to my mother concerning my own lack of victories. I didn't see that I should produce an impressive list of victories so that I could compete on an equal footing with some of my peers. Rather, I saw our job as being to tackle the RAF and to clear the way for the invasion. My lack of victories just represented to me the tangible evidence that I wasn't doing my part as well as I might. It had nothing to do with my personal ambition. Also, when reading between the lines, 2 things seem clear. Firstly, I was becoming very tired through constant action and from not being able to rest at night. Secondly, the first doubts were beginning to creep in about the invasion. We were aware that good stable weather was required, and it was obvious that the instability which preceded winter was beginning to come in. I think we all felt at the time that, if the army didn't get their fingers out before long, much of what we had done and suffered might go to waste. The disturbance at night reminds me of our first personal contact with one of the enemy. At the end of August, a lone Spitfire was bold enough to detach itself from a larger formation and make a low-level approach on our field. Unfortunately, he was hit and the pilot had to take to his parachute. He turned out to be a sergeant pilot and was taken prisoner and brought to see us. Naturally, he was treated like a hero and was offered the best of everything we had to eat and drink, and we all had a fine time. One thing I distinctly remember about him was that if any of us made any fun remarks about Churchill, he'd correct us by saying, "That's Mr. Churchill, if you please." Towards the end of September, beginning of October, we again had contact with an enemy pilot. At about dawn, a light bomber was hit by our flag and tore into the ground just 200 meters from our tents. Naturally, we all ran out to see it and found a jumble of wooden formers and other details all wrapped up in the canvas covering. We couldn't identify the type, it was such a wreck. It looked as though all of the crew were dead, but then someone spotted that the pilot was still moving, though trapped in the wreckage. From within the tangle we heard the ominous crackling of fire and soon saw the black smoke begin to curl up as fire took hold. We began to try to pull him from the wreck, but it was no use. Then Dr. Greiling appeared and told us to use what extinguishers we had to keep the fire away from the trapped man, whilst the rescue crew began to cut through the mass of wires and wood. The poor man wasn't even unconscious and knew that the fire was spreading, but he kept calm. I wanted to walk away from the hideous mess. I didn't want to be there if the fire got to him. But then he asked for a cigarette, and I was the only one with any to hand. With his arm free, he smoked a cigarette and cursed vehemently about his mission. Soon the pain of his injuries began to overwhelm him, and Dr. Greiling gave him a large shot of morphine, which knocked him out. Through diligent and skilled work, our rescue crew got him out, and he was whisked off to hospital where, unfortunately, despite the very best medical care, he died after about 3 days. Soon after this, another sergeant pilot was brought down near us, and he gave me his mother's address so that if we were successful in our invasion, I could pop around and give her the news that he was okay. The nightly raids had now become so regular that nobody thought to go to the Splittergraben, which is the slit trench. There was no firm instruction about the use of trenches during the bombing raids, so we tended to stay in our tents. These, we judged, were just as safe, being dug into the ground by more than a meter, leaving us well below the path of any shrapnel or stray bullets. In any case, it was a damned sight more comfortable. There were, however, some clear-cut rules regarding the guards, who now had to patrol the camp. Because reports were coming in from other units of increased partisan activity, we now had a constant standing patrol. This comprised 2 fully armed guards during the night and 1 during the day. The 2 at night had been established because some guards at other units had been found with their throats cut. It was therefore the standing order that the 2 guards at night must remain together at all times and that they were not permitted to use the trenches during raids. On the whole, this worked out fine, but for one soldier by the name of Alois. He came from the Bayerische Wald, which is a forest area of southern Germany, and was a real bumpkin. He was hugely strong, but otherwise something of a simpleton. We didn't know how he'd got into the Luftwaffe, but he'd managed it somehow. He just loved aircraft and enjoyed being near to them, and to us. I don't know that I ever knew his last name. He usually just gave his forename and a broad, good-humored grin whenever he was asked, so we just called him Alois. On several occasions, Kühle and myself had had cause to speak to Alois or his supervising NCO about him diving into a trench as soon as our flag opened up, leaving his partner alone on patrol. This had happened again and became apparent we would have to initiate some official proceedings. Kühle therefore gave instructions for Alois to attend the Nissen hut, which was used as an office, and for Reinke, the squadron clerk, to be present to record the interview. There was a distinct possibility that Alois was going to be court-martialed for cowardice, with the subsequent formidable sentence. Alois was ushered in, beaming his usual friendly smile, and sat down in front of the desk. He was the complete picture of bonhomie, ready to do anything we required. Kühle wasn't to be put off and began his questioning. He asked if it was clear to Alois that what he'd done was cowardice. Alois was deeply offended and replied, "By no means, Herr Oberleutnant. I am not a coward. It was just because of my new motorcycle." "What motorcycle?" asked Kühle. "Well," continued Alois with complete sincerity, "a long time ago I ordered a new motorcycle and it was delivered just as the war got started. It's brand new. Before leaving for the war, I covered it up with hay in the barn." He confided in a quiet and suitably conspiratorial tone, glancing around to see if we would be overheard and his secret lost. We couldn't wait to see how this related to his jumping into the slit trench every time the guns fired. We didn't have to wait long. As though the answer were obvious, he threw his arms wide and announced, "When the war is over and I get home, I want to enjoy Motorradfahren. If I get killed, I won't be able to use my motorcycle, you see?" Neither of us was able to keep a straight face and, along with Reinke, burst out laughing. The official proceedings were obviously at an end, and Kühle dismissed Alois with a helpless wave of the hand. The only equitable solution was to take Alois off night patrols and to give him a greater share of day work. This worked out well, and it's possible that he did get back to ride his motorbike in the end, but I don't know for sure. On September the 15th, we lost Lieutenant Hans Bertel from the Gruppe staff flight due to an accident and not enemy action. In the confusion of a dogfight over Tonbridge, he was rammed by one of our own aircraft and had to bail out. The losses were beginning to build up, the tension was mounting, and even the evening discussions failed to help to diffuse some of the anxiety which many of us felt. Perhaps because of this, Kühle introduced a traditional card game called 1704. It was played for money, and although it was an apparently innocuous game, it was still possible to lose half a month's salary in one pot. I would play with my usual competitive fervor, intent on keeping a clear head, even late at night, but many of the others would drink a little too much and fall easy prey. It took different people different ways. Oberleutnant Reinbrecht, who was attached to us for a while, was always ready for a game but lost phenomenal amounts of money. I really never lost much or made much from the games, and this despite Kühle's apparent determination to beat me. He'd actually really got to like me and to rely on me as his deputy in the squadron, but at the card table, he was determined to beat me. To this end, he was constantly trying to get me to overindulge in the freely available drinks or to risk too much on poor hands. I don't know why this was, but it almost always backfired on him. At least I knew when I was throwing good money after bad and would stack before I committed too much on a shaky hand. In the end, it was difficult to work out which was more stressful, to lose at cards or to get excited by the continuing debates. Possibly, it would have been better just to take a few evenings of complete rest, but after the stress of the day's flying, nobody wanted to be alone for too long. The debates nearly always came back to the subject of battle honors and decorations, mostly prompted by the NCOs who felt more aggrieved than the officers. Why was it, they would ask so often, that the decorations are in the main only handed out to those with the highest scores? Wasn't it clear that it was those who were flying ahead and insisting on strong formation discipline around them who were also running up the highest personal scores, almost exactly matched by the losses from their own formations, losing one Kaczmarek after another for another white stripe on the tail of their aircraft? And who was it who was suffering the most, they would ask. Of course, it was the NCOs, who generally flew at the rear or on the flanks. High also on the list of losses as the battle wore on were the replacement pilots. They simply didn't have the experience that we pre-war regulars had acquired. In our Gruppe at the beginning of the French campaign, we had 36 experienced pilots, none of whom had less than 3 years flying experience. Now, we were getting replacements for the experienced pilots we had lost straight from the Jagdfliegerschule, which was the fighter school. At that time, we still tried our best to take care of these fledglings until they could accrue some experience. Typical of these youngsters was a young Gefreiter who arrived in late September. His flying time was minimal. He had only fired a few shots at a ground target, had never flown on oxygen, and still had no idea how to use his radio. We tried to increase their experience before they actually came along on combat missions by taking them up on patrols between missions. Then we would talk on the radio, climb to altitudes in excess of 8,000 meters, 25,000 feet, and make them use oxygen. Of special importance was teaching them how to change the pitch of their propeller to get maximum pull from the engine at high altitude. A flat pitch would allow the engine to rev up to its maximum so that the supercharger would deliver the maximum volume of air to the cylinders and produce optimum power. Changing to a coarser pitch would have that engine power converted into more pull and consequently speed our rate of climb. It was vital they mastered this technique if they were to keep up in a battle climb or at high altitude. After about 10 hours of tuition, we would take them out over the channel to shoot at shadows on the water or cross to Dungeness and shoot at a black medieval tower which stood there, which is the old Dungeness lighthouse. Finally, when we could not excuse them combat duty anymore, we would have to take them along with us. This became the case with the Gefreiter, and so I took him as my Rottenhund, which is the wingman. We began our climb almost immediately after takeoff, and he was constantly using the radio to ask us to slow down so that he could keep up. It was obvious that he was manipulating the pitch control with the skill of the more seasoned pilots to produce the same power as our machines. We tried to tell him what to do on the radio, but to no avail. Eventually, about halfway across the channel and at 4,000 meters, 13,000 feet, Kühle told him to leave the formation and return to base. He broke away, but in his confusion, he turned not for home but towards Dover. Kühle realized what was happening and ordered me to give chase and take him home. I rolled out and soon overhauled him just before we reached the balloon barrage at Dover. I had tried to raise him on the radio, but he was in such a state of anxiety that he wouldn't or couldn't respond. Positioning himself in front of him, I rocked my wings, using the signal for him to follow me. He dutifully hung onto my tail and we were soon back at Coquelle. This was one of only 2 missions I missed during the whole of our time in the Battle of Britain. As a result, we decided that we would not take any more replacements on high-altitude missions until we could give them much more training. They were supposed to be replacements, but in the event, they were more of a problem for us than reinforcements for the squadron. The further we got into the battle, so the bitterness of the NCOs increased towards the victory hunters in our and other groups. The stress was beginning to show in us all. Now also we began to openly discuss the subject of channel sickness. Kühle told us that some court-martials had been instituted for pilots who had returned too frequently with mechanical faults which could not be found by the ground crews. As uncomfortable as they could be, we never directly avoided the debates and frequently locked horns with Karl Rüttger, Kurt Wolf, Lothar Schieferhofer and Siggi Voss. It was a different story with Oberfeldwebel Große, who absented himself if it was obvious a debate was brewing. He had already served with the Condor Legion and already had quite severe stomach problems. He He was also one of those who had begun to suffer more than average mechanical returns to base. It seemed he could just wear out like any other machine. After a lot of use and abuse, your mind and body began to give minor problems which, if not properly repaired, developed into more serious faults and then to final, total breakdown. The human body is only different from a machine in that it rarely actually needs replacement parts. Given proper rest, it will repair itself. And that is where things were going wrong. We just weren't getting a break. And there you go, Uli's first aerial victory. Even though there isn't much he can tell us about it since he barely remembers the action. He probably was extremely excited at the time and his mind just blanked it out. Generally speaking, we get a very nice insight into the morale of the Luftwaffe back then. While they were highly motivated, they were on constant alert and flew missions practically non-stop. That this will wear out even the strongest pilot is obvious. This, plus the required training of new pilots after the losses of veteran aviators, put an extra burden on them. And finally, the multi-tier system of NCO pilots and commissioned officer pilots caused some distress. Like Uli said, the NCO pilots usually served as a barrier for flanking attacks and as such were usually the first to be attacked. They were lovingly called Kaczmareks, which is a Polish surname, in fact the most common Polish surname meaning innkeeper. It's like calling someone a Smith or a Müller. I will put a painting on screen that was found in one of the huts that Uli lived in, the author is unknown. And finally, something that I too have experienced in the service, and that is creative bookkeeping. However, with us, it was the other way around. While the guys back then tried to mask lost equipment as being destroyed during an air attack, we sometimes had to hide surplus gear from inspection. For those that don't know, Germany has signed the so-called Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, which, among other things, calls for transparency in regards to armament. It allows delegates of treaty nations to inspect the armed forces of other treaty nations and look for covert up-armament. Now, the whole thing is pretty dumb in itself because those inspections came with a warning, and how would you detect covert armament programs anyway? But it was actually put in practice mainly by the Russians. So, at some point during the week, my company would get an advanced warning that a Russian delegation was incoming and perform an inspection in 3 days' time. The result was that every bit of surplus gear that was somehow linked to armored vehicles may or may not have been put on a 2-ton truck and hidden somewhere in the woods as to make the books line up with the inventory. As soon as the Russians left, everything may or may not have been put back. Such was life. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.